Hello everyone, welcome to the first session of the day. It's on housing and city. We've got Ruth Lorimer who organised today's conference and who open spaces. And we've also got Katya who works with London Renters Union and organised with them speaking about housing. I think to start with, we're going to ask a question to the audience.
Yeah, we thought we'd get you guys a session and like round your tables, if you could talk about what opportunities you think there might be for struggle and for challenging capitalism within the context of housing and the city. For
5 minutes?
5 minutes? For
5 minutes?
5 minutes?
Right, we just want to basically just move things on a bit. If you've had it sounds like there's a lot of discussion been going on, so if we just have some feedback from what people think in relation to that question in the first place, and then we're going to move on, people think in relation to that question in the first place, and then we're going to move on to I should have introduced myself. I'm Bev. I've come down from Manchester and I'm in RS21. Ruth is going to then follow up with a contribution, which will be about 15 minutes, and then Katya is going to follow on from that, and then we're going to take it back to the discussion. So does anybody want to just feedback what they have sort of like come up with in terms of how to respond to attacks on
I'll start. So I want to we talked about gentrification, council housing and so on, but I want to preface that by saying that since this is a conference on social reproduction theory, one of the contributions that I think SRT can make in thinking about housing is we understand racialization usually taking place in the labor market. Company relations are understood and theorized by people like, lots of people, Marxists anyway. But I think housing brings it down a level and shows that how actually the reproduction of labor power is actually differentially reproduced across society. So it brings it, contributes to that. So we talked about, Joe talked about gentrification and the effects it had in his hometown of Boston. Alex talked about homelessness in LA, but what I say is Democratic Socialists of America is working to push a rent control bill in California right now to make rent control legal again. And one of the reasons for that is, diseases that people thought was back to the city, and homeless people, families living on the streets have been diagnosed with typhus. And Charlie made a really good point that public housing in the UK, as opposed to the US, actually kept out people of color in this country till the 70s and 80s, which kept out people of color in this country till the 70s and 80s, which was the reverse of the US in a certain way. So,
anyone else? Any other feedback? Yep.
Yeah, we talked a bit about establishing renters unions and how they're a good way of fighting back. And we were talking about some of the difficulties there are in terms of licensing of landlords. Sort of anybody who applies to be a landlord pretty much could be allowed some form of sort of selective licensing would be a good thing. And we also talked a bit about also when having a more sort of fail-safe system, or have sort of management companies running their properties, and they want to kind of, they want to approach the landlord about doing some work, but they don't feel that they feel they can do that, because when you're having to renew your tenancy every year, and then you're having to think, do I tell them, that can be a bit of a problem as well. So.
Any other tables? Anything they want to feed in? Yeah.
We were talking about an example in Spain, which is La Paz. Maybe you've heard of it. It's literally a platform of people affected by some years now, and it has like a national coordinating committee, but actually locally there are like several branches, and it gained a lot of momentum because her former spokesperson is now the mayor of Barcelona, and it's actually, I think, a very powerful example of how people can organize against evictions and to demand housing rights.
Okay. Any other contributions?
Yeah, in Manchester.
Contributions.
Yeah, in Manchester, there's been a group called Acorn Renters Union, which is mainly focusing on private rent, that's really taken off over the last 6 months-ish. And the main focus of that has been targeting some of the bigger private landlords, and just a lot of the activity is just helping people write fairly good threatening letters to the landlord about different issues. And at one point the joke going round was that they wanted to do collective action against landlords, but they couldn't because the landlords kept giving collective action against landlords, but they couldn't because the landlords kept giving in. Which is really interesting because it shows how little regulation and policing, if you like, of tenants' rights there's been. That if a group just basically educates people about tenants' rights, there's been. That if a group just basically educates people about their rights and helps them assert those rights, that can actually have quite a big impact. But that seems to be getting quite a bit of success and involvement at the moment.
Okay. Right. Okay. Pushing forward.
Okay, great. Yeah. So I know that I kind of thought that Katya would probably be talking about housing, more specifically, having been involved in the London Renters Union. So what I thought I would talk about is a bit more broadly about the city. I was thinking up different angles and ways to approach it, and I've ended up writing a talk which was quite a lot about the gig economy, which I hadn't expected to find myself talking about. So bear with me. And I thought it would be interesting to think about the city and the kind of sort of permeable border between those two kinds of spaces, and the way that those areas are being mined for profits at the moment. But just to sort of start off even more broadly, I want to say they've always been kind of shot through with contradictions. So on the one hand, they're places that people come to because they're exciting, where you can sort of break out of the strictures of small town or rural life. They're places of creativity and difference, where people from different cultures come together to create new cultures. It's where you go to be accepted or to reinvent yourself. So cities can be really unpredictable places, where the conditions exist for political ferment and political resistance exist just as much as cultural experimentation. But all of this unpredictability, the very thing that makes cities attractive, to a lot of people is premised on inequality. The city only has this kind of melting pot quality because people are forced into unexpected places by poverty or by war that means you have to leave your country and migrate to somewhere else, or other factors like that. So the city offers a place for people who have been displaced, but it is no utopia. Extreme poverty and extreme wealth have always kind of coexisted really uneasily in a city. And because of this, the city is impossible to understand without thinking about the role of the state. Kate mentioned the Peterloo massacre earlier on, and the fact that it was in response to urban revolt that the first police force was formed, and this is kind of the story all the way through, where the city is kind of quite often the birthplace for experimental technologies of social control that then get rolled. It's always social control against the state's own citizens. And also so much of the social reproduction of the city, of urban life itself, like the transport system, the waste disposal system, social welfare, is all managed through the state. So precisely because the city is managed through the state. Precisely because the city is so full of these dangerous contradictions, the state has always been very concerned with keeping order in the city. And one of the fundamental ways that it does this is by keeping things in their place. So by keeping separate what might otherwise come together, either in a violent confrontation, or even more dangerous, in unexpected solidarity. Urban state planning departments worked really hard when they were a thing to create specialised spaces in the city so that capitalist production and circulation could take place. Suburbs, central business districts, the projects, banlieues, council estates, gated communities, ghettos, all kind of owe their existence to some extent to the ideology of planning and zoning, the idea that in the city you've got to have discrete spaces for different functions. And at certain points in history, so people like Jane Jacobs, who wrote a book called The Death and Life of the American City, it sort of launched an attack on this kind of anti-urban approach to the city, and a defence of the street as this kind of special space in the city where people came together and kept an eye on each other. So in some ways her criticism came from quite a conservative idealisation of the neighbourhood and the local. But she was definitely right to notice, I think, that by creating these dedicated spaces within the urban realm for different functions, you risk undoing something fundamental about urban life, something that kind of knits it all together. Of course, these days planning departments either don't exist or they're incredibly small and much less powerful than they were in the heyday of planning in, say, the 1960s. And it's the market that's driving urban segregation, with the state kind of trailing on behind, trying to keep up. In cities like London, high rents and speculative development have led to a kind of this sense that the whole of the inner city is becoming a specialised area for to work in that industry. Despite the existence of some little pockets of social housing in central areas, increasingly working class people can't afford to live in the city without making serious compromises to their lifestyle. So you can live in the city if you're single and childless, and a shared house with other single and childless people. Those with families have to move out into the suburbs. So you've already kind of got this specialisation of this sort of dormitory, this workforce that kind of live in almost dormitory conditions in the city centre, and families pushed further out. Also, those living in the city centre often seem to feel that they're forced to be transient. Because the rental market is based on short-term lets and there's so much speculation in the housing market, and buying a house is just an absurd daydream for most people. You end up having to move around just wherever you can afford the rent. So urban life becomes this really precarious existence, not just because of the insecurity of your housing tenure, but because of all the kind of knock-on effects of that. The fact that you don't end up feeling like you're secure and with whom you can share out the tasks of the social reproduction of your own selves and your own labour, and so on. But paradoxically, those who are living in the city centre with all of these insecurities are being forced more and more to rely on services that are offering to take on some of these tasks that are traditionally performed within the household. Not having a kind of dense network of neighbourhood connections and family, you also have a lot less time. So people in the city work longer. In London, we work 2 hours a week longer than the national average. and our commute is 20 minutes longer than the national average at 75, meaning that household self-sufficiency just isn't really an option. We have to rely on these outsourced services in order to socially reproduce, well, to reproduce ourselves and our labour. So this is where I kind of found myself looking into the gig economy, which seems to be really heavily advertised in London, and it'd be very interesting to know if this is happening elsewhere in other cities or in smaller places. TaskRabbit, Airtasker, these services where basically they're aimed at middle class people who just haven't got enough time on their hands to do all of the chores that they need to manage to get all the things they need to get done. And it's kind of advertised as being a peer-to-peer service. So you get this really distinct impression, and I was going to show the adverts, but didn't really organise that very well. But have a look at them. The adverts for both of these services are fascinatingly similar. They both show a household of people of colour outsourcing some task like fixing up their flat pack furniture to an Airtasker or a Tasker who is white and very clearly middle class. In one of them, he's like, before he gets the call to do the job, he's misting his orchids. Seriously, it's a cartoon, but it's like. So these aren't people who are professionals who are relying on this work in order to make their living. They're just middle class people who do this as a hobby, you know. So it doesn't actually matter if you pay them a living wage or not, because they don't need the cash. Also, they're all middle class people just like you, so you're not actually really exploiting them. And you know, it's this kind of quid pro quo sort of image that gets who work for these services are migrants, and they're on extremely low pay, and they're people who work in these industries anyway, but they're finding now that they're forced more and more to get their customers through these kind of apps because they're cornering the market, and you know, people know that they can get cheap deals. They have to pay insane amounts of commission. It's something like 30%. So it's not quite the image that we're presented, but it's sort of, there's this idea that having this buffer in between the person doing the task and the middle class person who feels guilty about paying somebody extremely low wages to clean their house. Having this buffer kind of... another one is, another significant area in terms of social reproduction where this gig economy is, as we know, becoming extremely important is food. So Londoners take out or eat about 43% of their weekly lunches and dinners in the credit crunch. And in 2013, those numbers went up to record highs, with Londoners eating an average of 3.7 meals out a week. So it's got to the extent that developers in some of the new apartments that are being built in London are saying, oh, well, we don't even really need to build proper kitchens in these flats because Londoners don't cook because they eat out all the time. So you kind of end up in this vicious circle where you don't have time, and also now you can't actually get the facilities to do all of these tasks. You have to outsource them. But because you're paying extortionate rent, you can't really afford to pay the average of £6.60 extortionate rent. You can't really afford to pay the average of £6.60 a day for lunch, which is the most expensive in the UK. So we're caught in this kind of bind. Sorry, I'm just skipping over a bit that I already said. So that's the kind of social reproduction in the city that I already said. So that's the kind of social reproduction in the city that I think is growing increasingly significant, this sort of hidden servant class that's being created in the city, which is mostly migrants. The gender division of labour remains intact with cleaners on these kind of apps and care work, personal service with cleaners on these kind of apps and care work, personal services like nannying being done almost exclusively by women, and the kind of traditionally male jobs like home repair and plumbing and that kind of thing still being done by men. But just in and there's a really remarkable similarity in the public services sector and the kind of services that exist to keep the whole city functioning. So the kind of social reproduction outside of a household, the transport system, the waste disposal, all that kind of thing. How am I doing for time, by the way?
You've got 3 minutes.
I've got 3 minutes. Is increasingly in London, we're kind of catching up with cities like New York and Tokyo, other big global cities, in the extreme occupational segregation of this workforce along migrant lines. This is in another. Although 35% of London's working population are migrants, foreign-born migrants, they make up 46% of what she calls elementary jobs, so domestic workers, cleaners, caretakers, porters, and so on. And within that, there's increasing differentiation and specialisation of in different. So, for example, 41% of working-age people born in Slovakia now living in London work in personal services as nursery nurses, housekeepers, and care assistants. They did some research interviewing cleaners on the London Underground, and although it wasn't a complete sample, I think they interviewed something like 350 people, but it was just found that 96% of people they interviewed were from Nigeria or Ghana. So like a really extreme segregation, which they argue is because, although perhaps in the 1990s, London, there was a bit more of a safety net in terms of social welfare that has kind of been stripped, away, and working conditions are much worse, and there's more immigration and so on. So given that I've only got a minute left, I kind of wanted to maybe just end on something that's like slightly more. I kind of wanted to maybe just end on something that's like slightly more positive about this picture, because it seems a bit scary, but we've seen a lot of examples where the gig economy where people who are working in for example Deliveroo and so on have taken strike action where and that's been quite effective. So although these kind of new platforms seem like a method of mega exploitation of the urban workforce, there are also potentially opportunities for resistance built in. Into that system, which maybe we can talk about more in the discussion. So I've completely run out of time to say anything else, so I'll leave it there.
So I'm going to give an overview of the changing role of housing in the political economy, and then go on to talk about what's happening within the London housing movement, and talk about the role of housing struggles in a city like London. Amongst revolutionaries and the wider left, there's a housing as of some importance through the housing question, but still resisted making it a core concern. Clearly, housing is vital to social reproduction in the sense of it being vital to the reproduction of a healthy labour force. This has long been understood by both Labour and the Tories. In fact, both the Labour Party and the Liberals built mass council housing after the Second World War. The Tories have always seen housing as a key means by which to shore up their base through the pursuit of a property-owning democracy. Something the Tories talked about in the early 20th century, but as a policy proposal came into its own under Thatcher's right to buy. One of the key contradictions now is that despite several decades of efforts to achieve a property-owning democracy, the Tories have actually failed in this endeavour, with a result, as you all know, that millions of people are locked out of the housing market, housing costs are skyrocketing and way out of step with ordinary people's incomes, effectively threatening the Tories' voter base. All of the key marginals at the moment have very high proportions of renters, and there's been lots of talk recently in new pieces of research. Around the renter vote being critical to the next election. But to go back a step, I want to argue that housing is woven into the contemporary capitalist political economy in three critical ways. This can be understood as, firstly, housing as commodity, in the sense that housing is just like any other commodity in that it can be bought and sold, that can be invested in and used as a store of value. Secondly, housing as ideology. This relates to housing as a key signifier of private property, which were less obvious in the early 80s, but for the sense that owning property gave you access to a key marker of being middle class. And thirdly, housing can be understood as a social relation that reproduces and upholds class relations, both in the sense that access to property is a key means by which wealth has been in the making for several decades. What's happening now in London can be seen as part of long-term changes to the global order happening across the world, deregulation, neoliberalism, and privatisation. I want to discuss the specificity of London's housing crisis and how it became particularly acute. After the financial crash 10 years ago. But first, to go back to what caused the crash in the first place. So, in the run-up to the crash, for many years, aspiration for private home ownership was encouraged. Aspiration for private home ownership was encouraged culturally and through mortgage products. As people know, this ultimately led up to a ratcheting up of unsustainable debt on an individual and global scale, and then to the crash of 2008. In London, before the crash, for some years that we had the rollback of the rollback of the welfare state, sell-off of council housing, the stripping of the few rights that private renters had, and something particular to the UK, the buy-to-let mortgage, which led to a rapid rise of landlordism and profiteering through housing. So in London, rapid rise of landlordism and profiteering through housing. So in London, already prior to the crash, you had a situation where there was not enough council or social housing, and housing was treated as a commodity or something to make a profit of, rather than as a home for someone to live in. And as you know, that after the crash, things got three key reasons. Firstly, London's buoyant property market was seen as attractive to investors looking for a safe investment. After the crash, investors were on the search for somewhere safe to store their money. London property was attractive due to its high investment potential alongside low regulation, and the simple reason that being house prices in London and speculation, buying and selling housing for profit, spiralled out of control, pushed house prices and rents up even further. And all over the city you have the luxury developments popping up that nobody needs, and house prices and rents continuing to soar way out of step with incomes. That led to councils selling off inner city estates to release their land values, benefit cuts which meant that ordinary working class people could no longer afford to live in London. Essentially there was an assault on the poor under the banner of austerity aimed at driving out those who couldn't afford it out of the valuable inner city while welcoming in investors. Essentially measures led to an acceleration of social cleansing policies of regeneration, public land sales, council estate demolition, and led to changes in the social fabric of the city. And finally, the pension crisis and the removal of a welfare safety net has meant that housing is now vital to people's long-term financial security. And the buy-to-let boom of the 90s through the 2000s has created an asset class which the financial crisis ultimately exacerbated. So now we have millions of people stuck in private rented housing, paying high rents, with very few rights, with not enough council housing at homes that are. There's a sense of the haves and the have-nots. Those with property are essentially sitting on an inflating asset which will be passed on to their children, while those stuck renting with no prospect of inheritance have no choice but to see their wages go toward making someone else richer. And you have a government that only makes things else richer. And you have a government that only makes things worse. But as housing, as the role of housing in the economy caused the crash, I want to argue it can be at the centre of building resistance. Housing is at the centre of a society that's become much more unequal. The UK in the 20th century, centre of a society that's become much more unequal. The UK in the 20th century saw the emergence of a middle class bound up with the ideology of home ownership, but now falling living standards and the fact that house prices are out of reach for so many mean there's a growing gap between aspiration and reality. Housing is central to a crisis of social mobility, a crisis for middle class reproduction, which in turn is a crisis for the political class. There's a politicisation around housing. We're all living, well, everyone who lives in London lives London's housing crisis every day. It's a crisis, you can argue it's a crisis for everyone, except there's a generalised disaffection which is expressed over recent campaigns over social cleansing, the response to Grenfell, to private renter campaigns. So can housing be a site of resistance? This is one aspect of a more general question of struggles outside of the workplace. The city are perhaps at their most visceral and immediate when we look at its physical fabric and how people live. The symbolic importance of housing struggles are rooted in the ideology of home ownership and the current contradiction of the capitalist system that is no longer able to provide housing. In a sense, when people talk about class today in London, such as when they talk about social cleansing. But as well as this symbolic role, I'd argue that housing struggles have the potential to disrupt capital. The shift towards housing as commodity means that big capital, that is investors and developers, have millions of pounds invested in our housing. And actually, there's the clamping down on small landlords, which in recent government policies is actually about a wider picture of moving towards commercial landlordism that the government is encouraging at the moment. Housing's role in the economy is encouraging at the moment. Housing's role in the economy has changed, and therefore housing struggles play an increasingly important role in political economy. However, there are inherent difficulties of organising around housing. Housing campaigns tend to be short-term. Housing campaigns tend to be short-term for the duration of such as campaigns over estate regeneration. Renting itself is short-term, individualised, transient in nature. Private renters don't immediately identify themselves as one group with shared interests. This is now so bad, and the sense of exploitation through the fundamental power imbalance of the landlord-renter relationship is sharp, and people are prepared to hear radical ideas about housing and radical ideas about alternative means of housing provision. There's also a new development that even politicians themselves, when they talk about renters, interest group. As a site of struggle, we can and have historically at least partially removed the housing question from being a direct product of the market. Public ownership, community ownership and so on, and there's now growing demand to do this again. There's been several years of direct action and protests over housing around, as have campaigns such as the HDV campaign in Tottenham. There's a new renters movement growing that's organising renters and aims to transform housing through collective action. London Renters Union, which launched this summer, has grown fast and built thriving where members are taking direct action over members' issues such as disrepair and so on. Ultimately, the aim is to scale up from localised campaigning to a mass movement and to build a social coalition around renting and fight for immediate changes to the rental system while leveraging renter power for fundamental transformation of housing toward housing as a social good or homes for people, not profit. And ultimately, every step forward for renters' rights is always a step to removing incentives for landlordism and decommodifying housing. London Renters Union incentives for landlordism and decommodifying housing. London Renters Union is building a movement to demand secure homes for all and an end to racism and other forms of discrimination in access to housing, homes for people, not profit. Just to come back perhaps to for no borders in housing. Just to come back to that, I think someone mentioned, so you may have seen recently there was coverage in The Guardian around rogue landlords and kind of pushing the narrative that the problem with renting is the problem of a few bad landlords, if that the problem with renting is the problem of a few bad landlords. And then also linked to that, there was the issue of the limitations of licensing schemes. Actually, licensing schemes have been used as a form of internal border control, and licensing and enforcement measures to tackle rogue landlords have been used to essentially gain information on the tenants in those properties, and information about rogue landlords and their tenants has been passed on directly to the Home Office. So, I mean, that's a very clear way in that when we talk about housing, we're also talking about building anti-racist movements and movements for migrants, which is destabilising the very process of social reproduction on which it relies. As neoliberalism has created a crisis for social reproduction, there's an possibility of important lines of resistance developing around housing. And in London, there's important links between the struggles over precarious work and housing. Within housing campaigns, there's a recognition, I think, of the limitation of localised campaigns and of community organising for its own sake, and the limitation of a defensive fight over council housing, and that's been about which has helped, and that's been about helped found the kind of the groups that came together towards launching a renters union. And of course there are very different relationships within private renters are a huge group of people. They include private renters are a huge group of people. They include middle class renters looking to buy a home. They include people at the very sharp end of the housing crisis. There's also the possibility of getting some form of wins over renting or some form of private rental regulation that will ultimately lead to depoliticisation. But London Renters Union launched this summer, where the aim is to build a mass union based on active membership. Branches have been growing fast. There are now 670 members of the union, of which 370 are paying. In Newham, there are regular branch meetings twice a month with 30 to 40 being member development and developing leaders. I think what's exciting about Newham is that actually there have been many people who've become members of the union, and then through the support of their union and support of other members of the union, their housing issue has been dealt with. What has been really exciting is actually most people building a kind of strong branch in that sense, which people have continued to be involved in. There are some elements of what the union does that are borrowing from community organising, but it's about moving towards a more politicised form of community organising, of which political education. And yeah, and I mean, just in the last few months, it's been interesting to see the impact and the response from politicians. The Labour Party just recently committed to funding independent renters unions to I think 20 million or 20 independent renters unions to I think 20 million or 22 million, and there's been other kind of there's been a lot of engagement with the renters union as it grows. Ultimately, organised renters and the threat of a rent strike will have a huge impact on the possibilities, and the threat of a rent strike will have a huge impact on the possibility of housing as business. So it's exciting. It's really exciting to see, but welcome people's discussion and thoughts.
Right, thanks very much, Katya. Thanks, Ruth, as well. Right, just any thoughts on that? Just anyone want to ask a question or make a contribution? Ask a question or make a contribution?
I had a question, which was, you talked about property being an asset, then pushing up the cost of housing because of all the kind of speculation and so on. But I don't. Is, if you like, normal people's housing being used as a speculative asset as well as like office blocks and luxury housing, or is it more that it's kind of taking up land and investment that should be going into? So how is that actually pushing up the cost of housing for people?
Okay, thank you.
It's just a London housing market. It's London's a magnet for money from across the world. So a lot of building, particularly the stuff that goes on in Canary Wharf, places like that, is built to be sold to owners from other countries who may then rent it out, but may actually just leave it empty. And of course, because the land's being used for that, it's therefore not being used for building, buy-to-let. So you do get a situation where you have a genuine shortage of supply in London, which means that private landlords can be much, much nastier in London than they can anywhere else, because the gap between what's much greater. But I also want to say something about the resilience of public housing. Because I was struck by something I was reading a while back. It said that a quarter of all council housing in Britain is now in London. We have actually better resisted selling off council housing in London than we have. I mean, that's partly because the sheer scale of some of the estates and the cost of the estates means it's actually just too much to swallow for a lot of the private developers. But it is one of the things that has, to an extent in places like, Islington, places like Islington, Lambeth, Southwark, Hackney would be much, much, much more gentrified if it wasn't for the fact that there are still those huge blocks of public housing.
Anyone else? Yeah. Anyone else?
Yeah, I mean 39 years I've been down in London next week, and the pace of the gentrification in some respects is just mind-blowing. You think David Cameron and the Notting Hill set and all that. You think David Cameron and the Notting Hill set and all that. In the 1970s, Notting Hill used to be squatters central. The great group, the Clash, the name before that was the 101ers, because that was the squat where they lived, was 101, whatever the road was. I've just seen it change so much over the years. The other week I was up in hospital and I was talking to this nurse, and she lives in, if you know, the Manor House, the Woodbury down the Estate. Well, half of that's been knocked down and given to private developers. But the scenic lifts and all this bollocks, I think the top price on this is, wait for us, for 3 bed, they want £1 million to live on the fucking Woodbury down the Estate. It's just, anybody that knows it, no offence, but for years it was a shithole. See, the squatters didn't want to go and live there. That's true. We were there 6 months ago, this is nothing, let's go. It doesn't have to move,
Yeah, I just want to ask a question, if that's all right. Yeah. I think that, obviously, I'm from Manchester, so all this stuff about London, I agree, I'm not disagreeing with everything that's been said here. The same kind of thing going on. There's a lot of empty flats being built in the city centre. They're empty at the moment, but maybe they'll get sold, but I've also heard that there's going to be no services there there will be families living in the city centre, and there won't be services like nurseries and playgrounds and children living there. And I think Grenfell did have a huge effect on campaigning in the north, in terms of campaigning around the foam cladding issue and other things like that. I just want you to sort of address the one you said that people work 2 hours longer in London than they do in the rest of the country, and on average. And I know that travelling times are pretty hectic in London. And I know that travelling times are pretty hectic in London. I mean, I was down at Waterloo yesterday evening. I nearly got knocked to the side by the swarms of people coming home, and it is much bigger deal travelling and moving around in London than it is anywhere else. And also there is like a contrast in other cities in Europe in terms of the way their housing and how it works, and my understanding is it's a lot more rented in Germany and France, and you know, it's just that thing. And is it just as bad in New York? Is the gentrification going on? Is it because London is this global financial hub? You know, that's the other thing. Yeah. Sorry, at the back.
Yeah, I'm over with the downstate, and I think we have to be careful about rubbishing with the downstate, because that is why a council tenant tell us our housing is absolutely rubbish and all the rest of it. And so I think, thinking about the history of the Rugby Downstate, it's one of the most wonderful post-war projects of the post-war 1945 settlement, and it was the largest social housing project in the whole of Europe at the time it was built. The John Scott Health Centre is still in London. It's actually a Grade 2 listed building. One of the first comprehensive schools was located on the Rugby Downstate, and there's a lovely library there, which is still actually there. It has been knocked down. And the people of the Rugby Downstate, they fought like fury to save their estate, to prevent the gentrification. It is what happened. It is absolutely no. But coming back to what Ian's question about, you know, why is housing such a commodity, and why is it sort of part of this sort of neoliberal market economy? Up until 1979, when the Divide came in, I think it's at that figure like 2/3 of the population lived. I think it's at that figure like 2/3 of the population lived in council housing. So housing wasn't a commodity. It wasn't seen as a market commodity. It was seen as something where, you know, that people had a right to, in the way that we have a right to the National Health Service. It was part of the post-war settlement. And since the right to buy came in, this is what has caused. The housing crisis in London. Is that housing is now about money and market and profit and pensions, and people don't have pensions anymore. What they have is housing, and it's all part of that sort of neoliberal project that came in with Margaret Thatcher. That's my understanding of the housing crisis anyway.
Interestingly, there was a development in Hackney, which is now being built. It's being built over the arches. It's just that it's now being built. It's being built over the arches. It's just that, and what was interesting? I went to this meeting. Sorry, one of these ones where the developers put somebody in front of you to tell you how marvellous and wonderful it's going to be. And I went to this meeting, and shops, and it's going to have like this nice walkway going through the back. It's going to meet onto this thing. I'm able to get people to the train station at Rectory Road really fast. Yeah, despite the fact that the head of the TRA on the estate it was about to go through was like not bloody likely, will they? All this stuff. But the way they turned. So they were talking about, I think it was 90,000 square feet, and there's going to be some housing on this. But they were portraying it as a business opportunity. I actually worked out the square footage which they were talking about, and actually the amount of square footage of housing was almost double that of the businesses which were being promoted as the way that they were actually getting it through planning by saying this is business opportunities. Yeah, with a stack of bloody houses on top, little flats and stuff. Similarly, Hackney Council is doing that with schools because they want to keep things inside the local education authority. So on the edge of the estate I used to live on, despite the fact that there was huge tower blocks which got knocked down, this whole thing about 400 houses being built, all low rise, nothing above five stories. We have a situation where now, slightly on the edge of the estate, there's an old school, which is a school for disabled, which has moved. and they're using that land to put another school on it, but in the ex-mayor's words, we're using our historically high land values to make this school, so they're making a single intake school with 2 tower blocks of housing above it. Right next to a estate which says we want it going on constantly, so it sort of ties into sort of the education stuff about housing where you can put schools, because old offices are being turned into schools for free schools, up and down happening. There's about like old houses or offices which are free schools, but to actually have schools on top of it to pay for them.
The issues around gentrification in Chicago are visible and devastating. In 2 of the most prominent Latino neighborhoods, Pilsen, which has been known for its immigrant rights activism for a long time, families have been displaced by gentrification over the last decade. Logan Square, where this has been going on for a much longer time, which is again another Latino neighborhood, over 19,000 families have been displaced over time, which is why the issues are reflected itself mostly in campaigns around rent control. Cities, at least in the north and the west, up until the 1980s. And there were various legal maneuverings to eliminate it by the big real estate interests and the banks, who are always the evil ones behind all of this stuff. Last year DSA won a big, well, on one hand, a big victory around this stuff. There was a citywide referendum about, which asks a question, would you support lifting the ban on rent control, which is imposed by the state government? And 70% of Chicago control, which is imposed by the state government. And 70% of Chicagoans who voted in the local elections voted yes to lift the ban on it. So there's widespread support for the idea of rent control, which all the housing activists in the city and DSA think is the first step in dealing with the issue. The other thing about the first step in dealing with the issue. The other thing about public housing is that public housing has a long and very complicated and very difficult history in the United States, because it was also used to segregate populations. So infamously in Chicago, some of the worst public housing projects were also combined with the layout of the highway system to keep African Americans separated from the rest of the city, and then they were allowed to decay and fall apart. So in the memory of African Americans who are probably the biggest impacted by from immigrants, the legacy of public housing is a very complicated and difficult one. It's reaching a real crisis point because in August there was a fire in the little village neighborhood of Chicago in an immigrant home where 10 children died in the fire. It was so shocking because from modern life, not so true before the 50s, but after that even the fire department spokespeople couldn't remember the amount of deaths that had taken place among children from a fire in the city. And until they looked it up and said it was 1959, which was the last time it happened, which is when a Catholic school. So these are really huge and very big issues, and they're very popular, but they also face huge political hurdles. Because while you can reach one level of support, you then have to then get to another level of trying to repeal laws that have been deeply ingrained for nearly a generation now. But they are also the ones that are radicalizing people.
Yeah, I mean, people have talked about London, and London is an extreme example of a process that's actually quite general. In Scotland, of 4 great cities, which is Aberdeen, Dundee, Edinburgh and Glasgow, only Dundee, I think, is still possible to afford to live in the centre of the city, and the other 3 people have been moved out either to the outskirts of the city or small towns are change as well, because it's now been regenerated in an aesthetic sort of way, and there's going to be a big tourist site, so the same thing will happen there. And what that means is a whole series of social demands get met, because people are housing now in the middle of Scotland, in Edinburgh and Glasgow. It's like a gigantic sprawl, almost connecting the 2 cities together. I live in a former, just outside, connecting the 2 cities together. I live in a former, just outside, a former mining village in West Lothian, so halfway between Edinburgh and Glasgow. And in the fields next to where our house is, over the last 5 years, there's been a gigantic housing scheme built. What was like rural is now this kind of huge urban thing in the middle of the countryside, which is great. Is now this kind of huge urban thing in rural countryside, which is great, because people can afford to buy the houses there, but there's no facilities. So there's no transport to take into their jobs, so everyone uses their car, which contributes to the environmental crisis. There's no, I mean, there's a dentist and a doctor in the village, but that's for coping with the existing population, not with the but that's for coping with the existing population, not with the extra 2,000 people have just arrived, with young children mostly. So, you know, no one's built a school for them. They built a school, knocked down the old one, so there's no new capacity there. So it's like, you can see how campaigns beginning to develop will be A, about transport. You see how campaigns beginning to develop will be A, about transport. You know, can we get an effective bus service, or some more trains, but a bus service to take people into the big cities, fast, efficient and so on, and can we have facilities like doctors, you know, schools, and kind of basic stuff so people don't either have to travel to them or there's overcapacity, overflowing, and be an area where kind of social movement and activism begins to develop is actually around about the question of what goes along with housing. It's not just affordable housing, but all the other kind of stuff obviously with it, which is not socialised at all.
Right, I've got one more person who's indicated. Is anybody else? Got about 5 minutes? Yeah. Okay. Back.
Things about the ideological role that housing plays, which Katya touched on, which I think is really important because basically since Right to Buy, you see the construction of this notion that the ordinary, the respectable thing to do is to own your own house. And if you can't do that, you have to rent privately. And that shift has been huge. What it does is it creates a single kind of housing property market, and that's deregulated, and that's deregulated, and it is incredibly prone to things like becoming like any commodity, a bubble that can rise around it. I think that's what's happened post 2008. In answer to Ian's question, it's you know the private equity firms investing in luxury housing was, if you like, a kind of a secondary effect. You already had lots and lots of money coming in internationally, buying up ordinary housing. You know, you've got a single market. With that, there has been decades and decades and decades of active government intervention to prop up this market. I mean, like every single time the government, both New Labour and Tory, has said, oh, there's a crisis in housing, what do? They create means to make it easier to buy houses, which essentially kind of, you know, and I think especially for the Conservatives, there's a whole layer of the middle classes. There's the kind of C2s that shifted from Labour to Tory in the late 70s, for whom housing is absolutely crucial, and that the idea that they would be their own homeowner, is absolutely crucial to tying them in to the existing order and tying them into the Conservatives. So the fact that those people can no longer, you know, they no longer believe their kids are going to be able to afford a home, and that's a really, really big deal. To be able to afford a home, and that's a really, really big deal. I think there was some research that I only saw published in the Sun bizarrely, but it came out that the biggest and most violent shifts from Tory to Labour at the last election were private renters in marginal seats. You have a kind of Thatcherite neoliberal picture of the world, and people buying into that can't be underestimated. And what's happening is that 10 years on from the financial crisis, that whole political settlement is in chaos. So this is a big, big problem for the Tories too, you know? This is a political crisis that I think you see most intensely in London, but it's also true across Britain, and it's also true across the developed world.
Right, I've got 3 people that I've indicated, so I'm just going to take those 3 people and then we'll come back to the speakers. So,
first of all, thank you for those 2 brilliant papers. Thank you. So I have just 2 brilliant papers. Thank you. So I have just 2 questions really. The first is how did the the crash of 2008 impact race relations vis-a-vis housing. Because in the United States, race relations vis-a-vis housing. Because in the United States, it was mostly people of color that faced the brunt of the housing crisis. So I'm wondering how that worked out in Britain, because that also had spiraling effects on domestic violence numbers, because people were forced to stay in particular relations because the housing possibilities had collapsed. So there was an absolute rise in DV numbers as well. And the state in the United States basically tries to carceralize domestic violence shelters for prosecution given to the domestic violence shelters than for actually sheltering survivors. So that again in turn fed into all of that during that housing crisis in the United States. So you're more encouraged to go see the police and you know. And so that was my first question. The second, because it's so important what is happening both in the United States and from Katya, your account of what's happening in the UK, that rent struggles are becoming so central to social movements in general. Besides the fact that there is a crisis in social reproduction, but what changed the character from these sort of struggles being consumer struggles as we understood them growing up in India in the 70s, that these kind of struggles were rights struggle, right? So besides the crisis, do you see any other reasons as to how these originally middle class consumer demands have now bled into an actual social movement, politics as well as recruitment area, for people to join them, because there's a distinct shift there. And my third was, are unions backing the London Renters Union? What is your relationship to unions? Sorry, stop. Okay, right. To unions. Sorry, stop. Okay, right.
Thanks. I have a question for Ruth, actually, that particularly pertains to the gig economy. One of the reasons I wanted to come to this is just for a bit of context, in the Los Angeles left, there's a big, and in Los Angeles DSA, there's a big debate right now that I think we're winning about the right to the city being a key component of anyone who wants to effectively take on neoliberalism right now. And that's partially because of specific developments in Los Angeles, particularly around housing and the fact that it's a massive city with almost no public transport where everyone needs a car and things like that. But that gets me to what it seems to me that what the gig economy does isn't just privatize things that people rely on, but it atomizes them too. It's not just about that these are now in private hands. It's like, oh, you can drive your car whenever you want and make money doing that. Like if you are part of Uber or Lyft or one of the rideshare programs. So it's like, and that has a tendency to kind of undermine collective struggle among people. But what potential do you see? Maybe I'm answering my own question here, but with Deliveroo and things like that spreading into some of the other gig economy type services, and the potential to sort of connect that with a more thorough demand for a right to the city. It's a broad question, but
political pressure. But it also worked because the Tories effectively gave the houses away. The huge subsidies that were given to existing tenants. Effectively you had to be a Marxist to not buy your council house if you've been living there for more about 10 or 15 years. So it was massively subsidised by the state. The second is the contradictory nature of private ownership right to buy is something that came up when I was active in the miners' strike in 1984, 1985. I was in West Yorkshire at the time. I was active around a couple of pits on the outskirts of Leeds, where the vast majority, where the vast majority of miners had either bought their council houses or lived in houses that, if you looked at them from outside, you'd call them middle-class homes. And the whole thing about housing came up, and the point activists made was that the people who owned their own homes were actually more committed to the struggle against pit closures than the renters, because the renters knew that the council would not evict them if they had kids. The homeowners knew that if the pit closed, they lost their home. It actually, the idea that you have nothing to lose but your chains, actually, because the chains were bigger, the threat of losing them was greater, and therefore the impetus, it wasn't the whole thing, but it actually therefore became an impetus to fight back rather than an impediment.
Okay, right. We haven't really got time for any more questions. Just a quick question.
Just a very quick response to Joe. The council hasn't given away thing is not. I don't think it's true. And I'll tell you why. Where I live on the estate, at least half is still council housing, and they're not Marxists. The fact is that poor people can't afford to buy, even when at first it was something like 50% and then later it was 30% sort of thing. It's not. It is what's often repeated, but I'm afraid it's not true. You know, as much as Thatcher reduced the price, they didn't make it cheap enough for the poor.
So yeah, I was just gonna maybe as someone said earlier, I think like one in 3 people lived in council housing at the end of the 1970s, and now it's 1 in 15 or 1 in 18. Council housing itself has been residualised in the sense that it's those who need it most. It's for the poorest, and the poorest tend to be black and brown people, but also in the sense that the kind of managed decline of council housing over time. I think some of the issues around race and housing kind of came to the fore around issues around housing and domestic violence, and the austerity and its impact on services supporting women with domestic violence, and the lack of those services essentially, and keeping women kind of giving some women no choice but to stay in the housing that they're in. There's been local housing campaigns in London, like Housing Action Southwark and Lambeth, and like Sisters Uncut have also campaigned around this. Sisters Uncut have also campaigned around this a lot. Within London's housing campaigns, I think they have tended to be very white and older. I think that's starting to shift around the kind of new renter organising that's happened. Just around gentrification, I think some of the narrative around gentrification in London has tended to obfuscate, or has tended to kind of be a sense of a process in which the problem are the middle class hipsters, living down the road, and can obfuscate kind of structural factors. And then Europe and the comparison with Germany, I mean, I think it's just there's less incentives to buy a home in the sense that it's much more difficult to make a profit out of housing when you have a situation where renters have protections and rights such as tenancies of 5 years and so on. And in the UK, you have particular, from the right to buy to the stripping of renters' rights to particularly buy to let, and how the buy to let boom of the just to kind of end on, I think like perhaps there's been kind of a sense in which there've been the housing kind of movement in London has been cross tenure, and certainly kind of within London Renters Union. It's a union kind of aimed primarily at private renters, but of course they aren't able to live in private rented housing because they can't afford it or are living with their parents. And this is a kind of all of these different kind of all of these things are kind of held, I suppose, within the renters' union, and in particular, there are lots of union members who are in some form of temporary or emergency housing. I'd say with London are in some form of temporary or emergency housing. I'd say with London Renters Union, it's about been about kind of building a kind of politicised union and making demands for public investment in public housing, which I think has been a bit different from some of the community unions that have sprung up. I think has been a bit different from some of the community unions that have sprung up. Around union support, there's been support from union branches, and but I think maybe in some there's been some sense in which I think the London Renters Union has been a bit of a challenge to organisation, to some of the bigger unions. I think the London Renters Union is making links with United Voices. I think the London Renters Union is making links with United Voices of the world and with IWGB. And then I was going to then go on to talk about renter struggles and linking them into kind of urban struggles and urban struggles which have been going on since the early 2000s, and the right to the city, and how important that is, I think, for the renters movement in London. I'm sure Ruth would have more to say about that too.
Maybe not that much in 2 minutes, but I'll go. Yeah, thanks for all the questions and contributions. Really interesting. I think what strikes me with the kind of this sort of massive hyper-exploited, racialized, gendered workforce is kind of being made necessary by the housing crisis, and it is also it's keeping the city going in the context of the housing crisis and allowing that crisis to continue. So it feels like these when we're thinking about how to politicize these things, I think that there is some potential for trying to work through those connections more effectively, at least in terms of, not necessarily in how we talk about them and think and analyse them and campaign about them. Just one final comment in response to Alex's question about the gig economy and the way that it sort of doesn't just privatise the workforce but atomises them. It's actually interesting when you're talking about domestic services. This is a massively atomised workforce anyway. These people who are going into people's homes, doing their cleaning, being their care assistants and so on. And the companies that are running these platforms are borrowing heavily from companies like Uber and so on, who found that it didn't really work having this completely atomised workforce. They had to actually provide some means for their workers to meet each other, and organise like their shift rota, how they were going to divvy up work and stuff. It hasn't really happened in the kind of personal services and domestic services industry yet, but you can potentially see how just having this platform might enable the workers to find some ways of collectively working back. And they have, in fact, I think it was in the States or possibly Australia where Airtasker started. They've already had a dispute with them. Some unions have had a dispute with them where they said you have to at least, they didn't manage to successfully force the platform to only allow people to set prices above the minimum wage, but it was a start in that direction. You could kind of see how they might be able to take it further. So maybe that's some cause for optimism.
Thank you very much.